You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. So we're under a tree canopy today in Somerset, and all will become clear because we are recording a new mini-series. It is late autumn. The leaves are just about turning, falling off the trees. And in this mini-series, we're talking about trees on farms. And it's a subject that we often skirt around the edges on the podcast, but I wanted to really go into depth on it. And so I'm really pleased to have teamed up with the Forestry Commission to make this mini-series, which covers everything from the benefits of continuous cover forestry and woodland wildlife to agroforestry, trees as part of regenerative systems, and how to make money from trees on your farm. And to guide me through this series, I'm going to be joined for these 3 intriguing episodes by my Forestry Commission co-host, Mr. John Burgess. John, do you want to introduce yourself and just give us a little bit about your background and why we're making this series in the first place?
Yeah, hi Ben, thanks for inviting me to get involved in this. Really glad to be here, and thank you for coming out into the woodland. I'm a partnership manager, but I also wear a second hat, which is Woodland Resilience Officer. So yeah, it's my job to just get out there and talk to people, answer questions, enthuse and motivate people to create new woodland, to improve their existing woodlands, and to protect the valuable woodlands that we have in this country. The other role as Woodland Resilience Officer, I think, is absolutely fascinating because it's about making sure our woods are fit for the future. So the threats of pest and disease, climate change, mostly it'll be drought and higher wind speed. So yeah, to advise people on how to make their woodlands more resilient. So that's what I do on my day job. But with this series, just hopefully to explore some of the issues that could help unlock some of those barriers to woodland creation. The Forestry Commission are really interested to increase woodland planting, and we obviously need to engage farmers to do that. Our traditional pattern of woodland creation has been steadily increasing woodland cover over the last 100 years, but with the government's targets to hit net zero, trees are a huge part of that. And really interested over the course of this series to investigate with you some of the options that might be available for people.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited for this. I think it's going to be fascinating. Are you a podcast listener?
I do listen to a range of different podcasts and I have heard some of yours.
This is your first time hosting a podcast?
Oh, crikey, yeah. Never been on this side of the microphone before.
Oh, great. We're going to have a lot of fun then. And obviously, your role as a host here, we're going to be asking a lot of questions on this side of the mic. So what are some of the questions that you are most interested in asking our guests? Because we have a fantastic range of guests coming up over the series.
Yeah, so I'm really keen to just hear those kind of case studies from the land managers. Everyone has different motivations, everyone has different objectives, and just to understand why people do forestry. I'll never tire of hearing those stories. And also the lessons they've learned along the way, because every single corner of the land is different. You need a different response to the forestry needs that person has. So just hearing some of our guests talk about their experiences will be great, but also some of the more cutting edge stuff, the stuff that is new, really, new topics, new agendas. So regenerative forestry and agroforestry, not things that have been in the mainstream. Really interested to explore those in more depth as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, similarly, I'm really, really looking forward to it. I suppose just being on the other side, spending more of my time in a field than in a woodland, I'm personally really looking forward to making that step, listening and hearing, like you say, from those case studies and seeing what we can learn. So yes, trees on farms is what we're going to be focusing on in this series. And in this first episode, John and I were joined by Clive Thomas, a senior advisor in regenerative forestry at the Soil Association, to discuss the broad topic of woods and nature, asking what the benefits really are for wildlife on your farm, both in the context of any existing woodland you may have on your land, or indeed new woodland creation, and the reasons for planting trees from a wildlife perspective. We also talked to Clive about integrating woodland and trees into farming systems to support overall farm productivity. We began by asking him to introduce what he does day to day and to go into more depth regarding his interest in trees on farms.
Thanks, John. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the invitation, first of all, to join you in this podcast. It's a great opportunity. I'm Clive Thomas. I work for the Soil Association as senior advisor on our regenerative forestry agenda. That agenda for us kind of goes from all the way from individual trees in the farm landscape, maybe in an agroforestry system or even hedgerows, all the way through farm woodland and then to our more extensive forests here in the UK. And what we set out in a report earlier on this year is that we think there's some principles that we should be adopting in terms of how we think about our land use and also how we think about our forest management to achieve better outcomes for climate, nature and people.
What is your view on the current state of nature in woodland? And is the picture similar all across the UK?
Okay, well, I think really we need to start with, I guess, the sort of headlines on that. So I think what we know about the overall ecological condition of woodland in the UK is that for our native woodland, I think only about 7% of it is in good ecological condition. And for our planted woodland, only about 1%. Now, there are some very good reasons for that. We have a very young resource of woodland in the UK. So only 100 years ago, we were as low as 5% woodland cover. We've increased that to about 13% woodland cover now across the whole of the UK. But what that means is that we've got a lot of young woodland, and it does take time to build up that nature, that biodiversity, those ecological processes with things like deadwood, veteran trees. But also we then have a bit of a mixed picture in terms of how we manage our woodland. So our timber producing forests are managed quite hard, you might say. So most of them are being clear felled on a sort of 40 to 50 year rotation and replanted. And then we've got a lot of other woodland on farms, which is about a third of our woodland in total in the UK, which is not managed at all, really, because of that sort of lack of integration with the farm and the farming system.
John, I'm just interested in your view on that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I've always is held as value is, as a consumer, how can you ensure that your purchase is coming from a sustainably managed resource and it's not from somewhere that has negative management practices. And I've always looked to the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme, and I know the Soil Association are quite big players in that. Clive, have you got anything to explain the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme, perhaps in one sentence or more?
That's quite a challenge. So the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme is the standard in the UK that tells us that if a forest or woodland is managed to that standard, it meets international requirements under Forest Stewardship Council and PFC, which are the two big international forestry standards. And as you said, John, there's a series of requirements in those standards that kind of define sustainable forest management. I think what we're advocating for in the regenerative forestry sort of thinking really is that we need to go a bit further on some of those requirements. Okay. Perhaps to manage some of our forests in a different way, still to produce timber and still to produce lots of ecosystem services. But as I say, maybe to think a bit more about the climate, nature and people objectives together in a rounded way.
Yeah, the true definition of sustainability. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say we might touch on that later, but can we broaden this out a bit? And John, again, from your point of view, I suppose on a basic level, what role can a well-managed small or medium woodlands, or indeed just increased tree cover on farms generally, play when it comes to boosting overall biodiversity on farms?
We talk about biodiversity. Diversity just means more species of life. Now, trees are fantastic habitat. A veteran tree in its own right has dozens, hundreds of associated species with it. So by adding that tree-based habitat onto a farm, you're just adding another layer over that land of species that have those habitat niches. So yeah, small woodlands or linear corridors of woodland, even down to sort of hedgerow trees or big individual open grown trees in fields. They could all have a role to play to improve the wildlife on our farms. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I suppose a lot of farmer listeners to this, they might have, because a lot of farms do have a small area of woodland on the farm already. They might have several kilometres in some cases of hedgerows. But I suppose, Clive, what about the wider benefits of actually taking more of an active role with your woodland cover, with your trees on your farm as part of your overall farm enterprise? Ultimately, I suppose, which is the broad question that we're covering this series, but why should farmers care more?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say on that, Ben. The evidence base has increased quite significantly in recent years in terms of our understanding about how trees interact with other components in the farming system. So whether that's livestock or whether that's crops, if you get your design correct and use shelter belts correctly, use infield trees perhaps correctly, but even maybe your woodlands as well, how you can actually get some productivity benefits as well as all the biodiversity benefits that John's just outlined from the management of those trees on your farms. So that might be things like improving soil health from a crop point of view, shade and shelter for livestock and also for crops. We all know that we've got an increasingly extreme climate in the UK, so not just winter cold and winds, but also summer heat. As I say, lots of evidence developing around how we can reduce inputs in terms of feeding livestock outside, have them outside for longer, not in the sheds, through that careful integration of trees and provision of that shelter. And then from the summer perspective side of things, again, lots of evidence about how, particularly, for instance, dairy systems can be the animals can be under quite a lot of stress once the temperature gets above about 22 degrees, I think.
Yeah, that was a key one this year.
Yeah, that can reduce milk production. So again, through sort of careful integration of trees into those systems, you can avoid too much loss of grass and productivity in terms of the kind of the farming side of it, but increase that sort of environmental mitigation for what you're trying to achieve on your farm. I mean, one way that I've heard it described, which I think is paints quite a nice picture, is kind of more of a 3D approach to farming. So sometimes that might be called more of a sort of layering, land sharing type approach, where you're achieving multiple things from the same area of land.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to hear the benefits to the farm from the trees, but what would you say the main pressures on the woodland that the farm puts onto it?
It starts really with that, that kind of 100 years of separation, you might say, that we've had between forestry and agriculture, where perhaps the benefits haven't been appreciated and the woodland hasn't necessarily been viewed as an asset on the farm. It's being viewed as something that's kind of there and you can't really do anything with it from a regulatory point of view. We've sort of intensified in other ways to mean that there's been less of a focus on that farm woodland resource. So I think that lack of integration has put a lot of pressures on that farm woodland, whether it's just sheer lack of management. Maybe there's livestock in the woodland in a sort of an uncontrolled grazing type way. I suspect the deer pressure is quite strong in many farm woodlands because the deer aren't being controlled, squirrel pressures as well. And then if you've got farm woodland in quite a sort of intensive farm landscape with lots of agricultural inputs, perhaps in an arable system, you can get quite a lot of sort of nitrogen pressures in the farm woodland as well. All of those things reduce the biodiversity, but also the wider productivity of the woodland from the farmer's perspective if they do want to start managing it.
So to maximise the benefits, you have to manage that infrastructure of the woodland and the trees.
I think so. And I think part of the key to it, I mean, farmers are very good at managing the farmed bit of their farm. I think that's one of the reasons why the Soil Association is advocating this integrated thinking about viewing those trees and that woodland as part of the overall farm enterprise and sort of managing it to achieve your farming objectives. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it is possible to sort of view trees and woodlands almost as a tool really to achieve some of those farming objectives and then also get these wider benefits to society.
When John and I went for a walk last week in the woods, we were talking about good practice, but also talking about expertise. And of course, farmers by their very nature aren't foresters. That expertise is specific, but also in terms of management, farmers will increasingly be doing a lot of this management themselves. So let's turn towards what good practice looks like on the ground and what you can do really before going out to seek expertise from elsewhere. What can you do? What can you do sort of straight away? And what should you be reaching out for some advice?
Well, I mean, I think it's possible to give some rules of thumb really to anyone who's going into a woodland, just a quick assessment of whether you think it is in a particularly healthy condition or not. So are you seeing a whole range of ages of trees, or are you just seeing, drawn up trees in a mature canopy and very little regeneration of new trees in that woodland? How much deadwood have you got? Some of the points that John was making earlier about the kind of richness of woodlands that comes from the sort of long-term management and the age of the woodland, and leaving those veteran trees and leaving some of that deadwood. Have you got a lot of deer pressure or grazing pressure from livestock that's incurring into the woodland? Those sorts of things that you can quickly sort of do a bit of an assessment. I don't think we're necessarily suggesting that all farmers become foresters, but certainly in terms of this kind of breaking down the barriers between the two sectors, I think there's a lot more opportunities to work together around kind of the idea of farm-scale forestry. And maybe starting to view some of those small farm woodlands across a landscape or in a catchment, starting to think about how they might be managed in a sort of more collective way. So doing some of the basic things that you would do with your farm in terms of setting your objectives, deciding on what you want to try and achieve, and then perhaps getting some expert advice on how to go about achieving those things.
Yeah, certainly that crossover between farming and forestry is something that we want to cover through this series. John, I'm going to bounce that back to you, actually. I know we were talking about some of this the other day, but some perhaps other rules of thumb when it comes to tree management, especially when it comes to biodiversity, as that's the thing we're focusing on today.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Clive, very great outline of the sort of snapshot of a woodland. My role in the Forest Commission is to look at future climate resilience. So what I would say, the way I would look at woodland is like, it's okay now, but is it still going to be robust and resilient into the future given climate change and those pressures? And that comes with just an increased diversity. So not talking a moment ago about biodiversity, but now talking about a diversity of structure, of species, of ages. So things that allow the woodland to regenerate. If you lose, in a storm, the canopy trees, do you have those second generation trees that will then come through up and maintain a woodland habitat and keep providing those ecosystem services? So if we have a drought, it might knock out a species of tree that is not drought resistant. If you have a new pest and disease, ash dieback, everyone will have heard of. If that knocks out ash from your woodland, do you have other species that can provide that sort of structure to it? So your wood needs to be sort of healthy now, but also healthy looking forward into the future. And that's just diversity. The more of it there is, not necessarily more woodland, but the more species, the more layers, that's what I would look for. So, Clive, one of the things that really interests me personally as a forester is the notion of continuous cover forestry and its benefits for wildlife. Could you, just talk on that for a moment or two?
Yeah, I mean, continuous cover forestry, I think, is quite a good descriptor, really, because, what we're talking about there is maintaining a continuous canopy of trees in a sort of forestry system, rather than clearing all the clear felling all the trees or felling all of the trees at the same time. Now, you can have a lot of sort of academic discussion about different types of continuous cover forestry, but I think at its simplest, it's that idea of maintaining that canopy cover and having a sort of full range of different ages of trees, and linking to the point that you just made, John, about diversity, because different trees have different degrees of shade tolerance and light preference. It's always helpful to have different species in your continuous cover forestry system to be able to use your light levels to maintain that sort of succession of young trees that are coming through. I think from the point of view of wildlife, I think the first thing to say is that there are some very well celebrated species that do very well actually in a situation where you do clear all the trees, and perhaps species that are more reliant on sort of open habitat. But I think generally, in terms of the kind of amount of biodiversity and the range of species, maintaining that sort of continuous cover canopy, not impacting too much on the forest floor as well in terms of disturbance, and that sort of careful management through continuous thinning and removals, rather than some big event like a clear fell, and then replanting with a new set of trees. Again, that can help to build up those sort of ecological processes. And that idea, perhaps going back to first principles, something I think we all know, which is that at the end of the day, forests are ecosystems, and they're quite good at looking after themselves to a certain extent and sort of building up that biodiversity if we allow them to sort of grow with as much sort of approach to natural processes as possible.
I'm really, glad that you sort of contrasted against clear fell forestry, which is perhaps people's vision of what productive forestry is, and that, a monoculture that reaches a certain age and then gets felled. But there are some species that really need that open ground habitat. So we think of coppice as being potentially good with, association with dormouse and butterflies. But clearfell is bad. But yeah, they're all tools to achieve the management objectives. And if you manage for those species that are on site, then you need to choose a particular management regime to benefit the things that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're advocating banning clear felling or anything like that. I think we just think that, particularly for our timber producing forests, it is possible for us to have much more of a sort of balanced approach to it, I think. Yeah. And I think what's really interesting, the continuous cover forestry pioneers, if you like, the people who are getting on with it on the ground, their entry point often is quality timber. So, the timber that can be grown in a continuous cover forestry system is often pretty impressive, because you're maximizing the volume on the trees that you want to fell, rather than felling a big range of small trees and little trees, as you do if you clear the whole site.
So let's move the conversation on and talk about ambitions to achieve net zero. Obviously, that's carbon net zero, which is where that big push, the government's current push for increased tree planting. For you, Clive, how do trees compare with other measures in working towards achieving net zero targets in the farming sector?
Forestry, I think, and trees has been sort of well celebrated, hasn't it, in terms of its potential role in helping us to achieve net zero. But I think the starting point for all of us, actually, whichever sector we're in, is reducing emissions, and going through that sort of diligent approach of understanding what your footprint is, your emissions footprint, and doing your absolute best to reduce it, and over time hopefully take it out of the system completely by the way you manage your land, or the fuels that you use, etc. But as part of that, there's always going to be some unavoidable emissions, even at an individual farm level. Certainly in the short to medium term, we're still going to be using fossil fuels, to power tractors and to power vehicles, for instance. So there will still be a footprint from any given farm. And I think, therefore, sequestering carbon in biomass, whether that's hedgerows, whether that's infield trees in an agroforestry system, or whether that's woodland, can form that sort of overall approach to net zero at a farm level, as well as at a sector level and maybe a national level as well. But I think, the focus, we've all got to find a way of doing our bit, haven't we? So kind of controlling the controllables, and an individual farm enterprise is something that you've got more control over than perhaps the national picture.
Let's talk about tree planting, because it's something that there are lots of incentives out there to encourage us to do. But once a farmer has established a new copse of trees, or perhaps expanded an existing woodland with new trees, in terms of practicalities and the time involved, and perhaps, John, you'll want to come in on this as well, but how much time will it realistically take maintaining those new trees and ensuring that they actually grow efficiently and effectively?
I will just go back to something that I learned very early as a forester, actually, which is that investment in good establishment of trees is a very sensible and wise investment, because if you can get those trees established effectively in the first 2 to 3 years, then from a maintenance point of view, you might not have very much to do for 15 to 20 years after that effective establishment, whilst you let the trees grow and begin to produce timber or produce shade or whatever your objectives are. And then you genuinely may be able to just watch your trees grow once they're established and away from those pests and threats for sort of 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, to support that, it's just what you're really doing is letting the tree get its roots down underneath that grass sward, underneath the weed competition. Yeah. Once you've done that, then the tree is accessing a source of moisture and nutrients that the other plants can't. So in a period of drought, the tree will be kind of okay and be looking after itself, as Clive said. So it is quite intensive for perhaps the first year or two, depending on what species you've chosen and how well that gets away. And then, you can sit back and just enjoy the fruits of your labour, quite literally, if you've planted some apple trees. Do also be aware of what the pressures are, what is likely to be the limiting factor for establishment. Is it deer populations? Is it weed control? Is it droughty soil? So once you know what that is, then you can take the appropriate protection measures. People tend to sort of default now to plastic tree tubes. We are looking for non-plastic alternatives, absolutely working to find something that has the longevity, but also provides the beneficial microclimate that a tree tube does. But just some traditional fencing can just keep the animals away, to let the tree grow up and away in those early years. And also I'll just say, get the right species for the soils, for the climates, for the exposure, for the soil fertility. If you get the species right, it makes everything else easier, because that tree wants to grow. You're not having to fight nature to establish that tree, which is a mistake we've made many a time in the past.
And as those trees develop over time, what wildlife might you expect to see at each stage, and what are those stages of development?
I mean, actually, you'll start to get some biodiversity even at a very early stage, because once the ground vegetation, the bit that you're not controlling to establish the trees, but once that's allowed to establish, then that will support much more sort of insect life. There'll be seeding from some of that ground vegetation, which will start to attract more farmland and possibly even woodland birds. But then obviously once the trees start to establish themselves and maybe get to what we would call thicket stage, you've got a lot more nesting opportunities for birds and some mammals as well. So you'll go through that stage as well. And then once you're able to start perhaps removing some of the trees and allowing some of the trees to develop in a better way, maybe some younger trees regenerating in there, again, that's going to support everything from sort of insect life through to birds and to more mammals as well.
As we've been discussing before, it's that increase in diversity will increase in biodiversity. So if you have more species of more ages, you just have more habitat niches, and that's sort of perhaps the way to think about it. If wildlife is one of your main objectives, then it will change through time. But if you have young regenerating woodland next to more mature trees, then you have opportunity to just increase at each stage rather than to change the species that you associate with that woodland. So again, just a plea for increased woodland diversity.
And in terms of, I suppose this is the thing that farmer listeners out there are going to be thinking of, what support is there out there for farmers who are wanting to make improvements?
The main Woodland Creation Grant, England Woodland Creation Offer, available through the Forest Commission. It does have minimum thresholds, unfortunately, of 1 hectare. That's the main woodland creation support, I think, available at the moment. There are other sources. The Woodland Trust offers tree packs. There are local grants in some geographical areas. So community forests have quite generous grants available at the moment. Hopefully you'll know if you're within one of those. Clive, anything else?
Well, I think if you're sort of widening it out from just woodland, I think there's still some of the countryside stewardship grants in place for hedgerows and things like wood pasture and something that maybe gets a bit closer to an agroforestry system.
Yep.
I think we're all waiting in anticipation for elms to perhaps
absolutely
offer a wider range of agroforestry system support, so that we can get more of that integration of trees in field, as well as, I think UCO is a very fit for purpose woodland creation grant scheme. But in terms of the wider integration of trees into farming, I think we need a bit more support.
So, I think almost the last question, Clive. If a farmer has some existing woodland on their land, but they're not actively managing it at the moment, but would like to improve it and bring it into management, what would you say is a good way to start in terms of practical action on the ground? And that could be some of the things we've mentioned about sort of thinning or controlling grazing pressure.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier on, didn't we, about that sort of initial assessment, and getting a good understanding of the condition of your woodland. Is it in good condition? And perhaps more straightforward to maybe move towards a sort of thinning regime, for instance, and start to remove some timber for either on-farm use as fencing or off-farm sale if it's of sufficient quality? Or do you need to take some sort of earlier actions? Perhaps you need to do some fencing to remove the pressure from stock incurring into the woodland and browsing. Have you got some tree disease in there? Might be something else that you need to look at in terms of, have you got a lot of ash in your woodland that you need to think about early removals because it's basically dying back? And then maybe some of those steps I talked about earlier, which is how can that woodland support some of your farming objectives? And then depending on your conclusions, really. Maybe getting some more external support, some advice to help you take forward some of that management.
Super. I think we'll leave it there. That's all we have time for. But a huge thank you to our guest today, Clive Thomas, for coming on the show. And also thanks from my point of view to my co-host. I'm enjoying having a co-host with me, John Burgess.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Enjoying being here too. On the next episode of the mini-series about trees on farms, we'll be discussing how you can make some money from the trees on your farm. And we'll be joined by Jemima Letts from the forestry team at the Chatsworth Estate, and Sam Watmore, owner of the Grascott Farm Forest and a thriving wood fuel business.
Yeah, so please join us for that. In the meantime, please share this episode amongst your farming network, and hope that it's inspired you to think a little more about what you can achieve and how you can achieve more from most of the trees on your farm. I'm Ben Eagle. My co-host is John Burgess, and this has been a Meet the Farmers mini-series on trees on farms, produced in partnership with the Forestry Commission. And John and I will see you on the next episode.